So they're going to ask, why did God kill every man, woman, and child living in Sodom and Gomorrah? All right? Listen, people had become so irretrievably evil. They became degenerate in their thoughts and in their actions. All right? In their actions, they were so evil all the time, not just sometimes. They celebrated evil acts and vilified anything good. They were so continually intent on evil that they worked tirelessly to morally corrupt other people. They wanted to impose their stinking values on other people who don't believe like them. Now you hear the calls about deprogramming those who don't believe like them.
And the question is, how are we going to really almost deprogram these people who have signed up for the cult of Trump?
Right? You hear them say, oh, what are we going to do with all these Trump supporters? Oh, we ought to deprogram them. They want to persuade and, if possible, force others to join them in their evil thinking and behavior. And listen, we're putting up with this crap.
Go back! We will not go back!
For the women who took to the streets all over America today, this was about stopping the reversal of the abortion laws their mothers and grandmothers had fought for.
They're trying to basically demonize us as if I had done some horrendous thing in my life. And so part of going there is to show that we're here and that we exist. And part of sharing my story is to at least debunk that myth that I did nothing wrong and people who seek abortions have done nothing wrong.
Basically, she's saying some human lives need to be sacrificed if they stand in the way of other human lives. Let me ask you something. Where's your personal anecdote for her? When you think about abortion, it's important to understand that this is an issue that goes all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to creation, all the way back to the garden, all the way back to the fall. If you remember, after the fall, God confronts the sinners. He confronts the man, he confronts the woman, he confronts the serpent. And the first time that the good news is proclaimed, the first time that the gospel is proclaimed, in its inception, is there in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. When God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. You will bruise his heel, but he will bruise your head. There in that picture, God proclaims the answer to man's sin problem, but he also declares war in that moment, the war between the serpent and the seed. How significant is this declaration of war? Here's how significant it is. In chapter 3, there's the declaration of war between the serpent and the seed, and the promise that the way God is going to deal with man's sin problem is through the promised seed that comes through the woman. That's chapter 3. In chapter 4, we have the first murder. What is the first murder? The seed of the serpent came, and I call him that because in 1 John chapter 3, John calls him that. The seed of the serpent, Cain, kills the seed of the woman, Abel. God declares war, and then Satan fires the first shot.
Listen, this was a society where every town, city, and state was already corrupted. Everyone is a reprobate except for Lot's family. But even his house was not, spared because he had sympathizers like his wife. Saints, this doesn't happen overnight. We become tolerant on evil and we begin to fondle it. And very soon we justify why it's okay to selectively cuddle with all manner of sins. In Genesis 19 from verses 1 to 9, we are told that angels visited Sodom to determine if its inhabitants were as degenerate as described in the report that they had heard. They decided to spend the night in this city square, all right? They spent the night in the city square as to observe the behavior of the Sodomites themselves. Lot was the only man in the city who had not yet succumbed to the reprobation, all right? He insisted that the angels should not try to expose themselves in the public square, but spend a night in his house instead of the city square. Evidently, he knew how dangerous his culture had become and how difficult it will be for anybody to try to raise his family in this place. He implored them to stay under the protection of his house, and shortly afterwards, Lot's house became surrounded by every man, young and old. Listen to that. It talks about men. Every man, young and old, from every part of the city of Sodom. The phrase young and old implies that men surrounding Lot's house included young boys and elderly men. Listen, our homes, all right, are losing fathers day and night, and dads are losing their opinions over their home. And because of this, degeneration is entering into our homes and perverting it. Listen, it says young boys and even elderly men. The men demanded that Lot sends angels outside so that they could subject these two angels to sexual violation. Basically, they wanted to sodomize the angels. This was homosexual sins infiltrating every perforation of the society. There was no stopping this lascivious, lecherous, immodest mob. They were flaming with diabolical passion. Listen, Lot wanted to protect the angels by compromising even his own two virgin daughters out. He wanted to expose his two virgin daughters out to this degenerate mob to do with them as they wished. The mob was so perverted that they no longer liked or desired women. They wanted strange flesh. They were lusting after anything other than human. Their vile appetite was no longer just confined to the human race. They wanted to debase the angels. Their evil appetite was unrestrained. The reprobation was so persuasive that even Lot, a righteous man, was in a grave danger of succumbing to the spiritual cancer that surrounded him in his time.
We live in times when it can seem that the evil one is succeeding in his program of lies and death. In our own nation, the federal government wants to codify as law the totally unjust decision of the Supreme Court, which made legal abortion on demand, and to impose upon schools the teaching of the iniquitous gender theory. At the same time, it threatens to deny the freedom of religion, the freedom of citizens to follow God's plan for the world and for man, inscribed in nature itself and written upon every human heart. In the face of such seemingly ineluctable developments, we are naturally tempted to discouragement and even to the abandonment of the battle against the evil one and his program of lies and murder. But Christ is with us to win the battle if only we engage it. We do not know when Christ will return in his glory. We do not know the last day, but we do know that we are called every day to prepare for it by our fidelity to the work of Christ's grace within our hearts.
This week, the executive director of Catholics for Trump, Catherine O'Neill, tweeted, "I think if St. John Paul II were still alive, he would deny Joe Biden communion because of his support of late-term abortion." Ed, can you clarify canon law when it comes to pro-abortion politicians and receiving Holy Communion, particularly how it applies to Joe Biden?
Sure. Canon law doesn't single out politicians necessarily as a special or protected class when it comes to the discipline of the church. Now, Catholics who are in an objective and persistent state of grave moral sin are not to present themselves for communion, and if someone presents themselves in such a disposition, they're to be denied in some circumstances, and that circumstance being, when their pastors had a chance to admonish them. Now, in many places, the specific teaching and discipline has been developed around politicians. In this country, under the reign of St. John Paul II, A letter came from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, signed by then Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict, addressing this point specifically and saying that persistent support for legal abortion was definitely sinful, to definitely meet this criteria, and that it was down to bishops and pastors to make sure that the politicians understood this, but that this, the having a public profile doesn't excuse you from the discipline of the church. Well, I think this is something that really gets lost a lot of the time, and it's a very important point, which is the church doesn't primarily say that people who are in states of grave sin, or for example are trying very hard to entrench abortion rights, shouldn't receive communion as some kind of punishment just. In fact, we believe, the church teaches, that if you receive the Eucharist in a state of grave sin, you're doing yourself very grave spiritual harm. So one of the reasons that the church says in her teaching and discipline that Catholics in this kind of state shouldn't present themselves for communion is for their own good.
The reason why I affirmatively came out opposed to the Hyde Amendment was that if we're going to have public funding for all health care along the line, there is no way you could allow for there to be a requirement that you have Hyde Amendment. A woman who doesn't have the money could not have coverage under health care.
Women's rights and women's health are under assault like we haven't seen in the last 50 years. And we've seen state after state, including Georgia, passing extreme laws in clear violation of constitutional rights protected, including Roe v. Wade. And some have gone so far in states to deny even any exceptions for circumstances that would involve the right of a woman to choose. And it's clear that these folks are going to stop at nothing to get rid of Roe. And it's clear to me that we have to just be just as strong in defending it. I support Roe. I support a woman's right to choose under that constitutional guaranteed provision. And quite frankly, I always will.
But one of the reasons that the church says in her teaching and discipline that Catholics in this kind of state shouldn't present themselves for communion is for their own good.
This is Jonathan Cahn. 232 years ago, in the first ever presidential inauguration, the nation's first president addressed a jubilant multitude and a nation that was united in shared values and a common hope in America's future. In that first ever presidential address, George Washington gave the newborn nation a prophetic warning. He said this: "The propitious smiles of heaven cannot be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right that heaven itself has ordained." In other words, if America followed the ways of God, his eternal rules of order and right, the blessings of God would remain upon it. But if America should ever depart from the ways of God, then his blessings would be removed from the land. And now, January 20th, 2021, another presidential inauguration takes place, and the nation's capital city, named after that first president, has become a military zone. For the first time in American history, a presidential inauguration is devoid of people. Instead of a jubilant crowd, 25,000 American troops stand guard over the National Mall, in which flags stand in for the missing people, and barbed wire surrounds the halls of American government. There is no war. There is no overt threat from beyond its borders. Rather, the threat comes from within. Division infects the land, as does a plague that has kept its citizens masked and locked in their houses, as the nation's functioning has been in large part paralyzed. For months, America's cities have seen protests and riots, and doors and windows shuttered and buildings set on fire. And the nation's most revered edifice of government, the Capitol building, taken over by an angry mob, with the nation's leaders fleeing for safety. And so the prophetic warning that was given on that day of that first inauguration, the smiles of heaven, are being removed from the land. And so the question must be asked: have we then disregarded the eternal rules of order and right that heaven has ordained? America, as did ancient Israel at the height of its prosperity, has turned away from God. We've driven him out of our public squares. out of the schools of our children, out of our culture, out of our lives. And as did ancient Israel, in place of his absence, we've let in other gods and served them. We've rejected his ways and embraced the ways of immorality. We've called evil good and good evil. And as did ancient Israel, we've lifted up the most innocent among us, our babies, and shed their blood. Israel sacrificed thousands of its children. We've sacrificed millions, tens of millions, unborn children who are not here this day, this inaugural day, because we took their lives. And their silent screams ascend to heaven, and their blood is on our hands. We've passed down rulings from Washington, D.C. that war against the eternal laws of heaven on human life, human nature, gender, marriage. We've indoctrinated our children against the ways of God. We have done as we were warned not to do, and then we wonder why the blessings of heaven are being removed from our land. When judgment came to ancient Israel, it manifested in the form of an enemy attack, a strike on the land, a wake-up call. It came to America on September 11th, 2001. And it came to the very place where George Washington stood and prayed on the day of America's first presidential inauguration. The biblical template of national judgment then ordains a period of years in which the nation is given the chance to return to God or else head to judgment. In the case of ancient Jerusalem, that period, from that first enemy strike to the year when the greater shakings began, was 19 years. From the strike on American soil in 2001 to the 19th year brings us to the year 2020, the year when the great shakings began. The danger that this window of time is drawing to an end is now upon us. We stand in a most critical moment. Mr. President, President Biden, you have called for unity and peace. But how can a nation have unity and peace when it wars against the very foundation on which it stands? How can a nation have unity and peace when it has turned against the God who brought it into existence? And it has turned. The nation that once led its school children in prayer and taught them of his word now declares such prayers and teachings to be forbidden, and now instructs its children against the ways of God. How can that nation have unity and peace? How can we have unity and peace in America if we have no unity and peace with God? We are a house divided against itself, and a house divided against itself cannot stand. Mr. President, how can you place your left hand on the Bible, the Word of God, and then with your right hand sign laws into existence that war against his word? How can you place one hand on the word that ordains human life as sacred and in the image of God from conception, and then with the other hand sign laws into existence that will promulgate the killing of that human life, of those children? How can you invoke the name of God in your oath and lay your hand upon his word, and then implement laws that will suppress the going forth of his word, that will censor his word and those who advance it? You plan to enact laws that will disregard the distinction between male and female, man and woman. Did not the warning of our first president involve that very thing? If we disregard the eternal rules of order that heaven itself has ordained. You plan to enact laws that will specifically neutralize the protection of religious freedom. You plan to strike down the Hyde Amendment so that more children will be murdered, and those Americans who recognize abortion as murder will be forced to support the act of murder with their taxes. And you plan to empower the act of killing unborn children not only within the borders of America, but throughout the world, to the end that yet more rivers of blood will flow. How does one do such things and name oneself as a believer in God and a follower of Jesus? How does one sign the sign of the cross and then sign decrees that rage against what God has so clearly set forth in his word concerning life and death, holiness and sin, righteousness and immorality, good and evil. To you, Mr. President, and all who have joined you in this agenda, from the Vice President to the leaders of the Senate and the House, and all who sit in halls of power and have embraced this agenda, heed this warning. This day will pass. The applause of men will fade. This administration will inevitably be over. This world will pass away, but you will stand before God and give account, for it is written in his word that we will each stand before God and give account. And on that day, all the power you once wielded will be gone, and all of the world's approval and praises will have faded away, and all the fame and glory you received will amount to nothing.
Let me say something. You better be careful when you put your hand on God. I thought of that in that inauguration. You can say whatever you want to say, but when you touch the ark, when you place your hand on the throne of God, because God is enthroned in his word, and you place your hand on the word of God and pledge to do the very things that blaspheme his name. You talk about a high-risk action. All Uzzah did was what he thought was showing some respect. God doesn't want your respect. He wants your obedience. Don't tell me that you advocate the slaughter of babies in the womb. Don't tell me you want to destroy masculinity, femininity, marriage. Don't tell me you want to fill the world with LGBTQ people in leadership. You want to justify transgender activity. Don't tell me you want to invite more Muslims in who represent a religion from hell, and then put your hand on the throne of God.
America's only hope is revival, return. Without it, the nation is lost. And revival only comes through repentance and return. It's time to pray as never before that return and revival would come. But it's time not only to pray for revival, but to choose revival, to choose to live in revival now. And for that, we must each commit to return to God, to put away from our lives that which must be put away, and take up that which must be taken up, and walk in his ways and live in his spirit as we have never done before.
If you pay attention to any type of news lately, you know that we are living in a time that is full of divisions and turmoil. Truth is filtered, the cross of Jesus is embellished, and to make it defensible to vacillating sinners who are impartial to truth. Our banner of righteousness has been compromised through liberality. Our salt is losing its relish. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "A man dies when he refuses to stand up for that which is right. A man dies when he refuses to stand up for justice. A man dies when he refuses to take a stand for that which is true." It's time for us to stand for truth and to contend for it. Do you want raw, unfiltered news from a Christian perspective? Along with insightful comments and analysis and regular updates to world's important stories that are affecting you as a believer, then click the subscribe button below to stay up to date with our latest video, commentaries, and make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking that subscribe button below.